Hello there, life science students. It's Mr. A coming at you again. Today I'm going to do a brief lecture with you on the respiratory system and the circulatory system. There's going to be two parts of the circulatory system. This is going to be part one. Before I get going on that, I hope things are going well for you. I'm going to show the assignment at the beginning as well as at the end for you to kind of be aware of as to what you're going to do. Like I said, we're going to talk about the respiratory system. But what I'd like you to do here is at the end of this, make sure that you answer questions from the respiratory system on page 564 in your text. By the way, you can get your text out right now. We're going to start on page 558 in just a couple minutes. I want you to tell me two things that you learned from the respiratory system as well as two things that you learned from the circulatory system. But one thing I want to caution you at is be specific with this stuff. You guys did a really good job of watching the previous video that I gave, and you gave a good job, many of you, of giving me some things that you learned, but be specific. And what I mean by that is some of you would say things like, I learned what the 6 nutrients are when we talked about the nutrition or the nutrients that you put in your body. Instead of saying, I know what the 6 nutrients are, tell me what the 6 nutrients are. Or instead of saying, I know what chyme is, tell me what chyme is. Chyme is a watery liquid substance that food leaves the stomach as. That's what I'm looking at for these. Same thing you can see here. There's 2 kinds of fats. Instead of just saying there's 2 kinds of fats, tell me that there are unsaturated fats and saturated fats. So that's what I mean when I say tell me 2 things that you learned. Be specific about things that you learned with the respiratory and circulatory system. If you're not, then you won't get your full points. So just be aware of that. And then rank the video and state why. I know that might sound kind of silly, but I like to know what you guys are thinking, if this is helpful or not, if there's things that I can do to make it better. So I want an actual ranking, like 1 to 10. Don't say good. Say I rank this, 8, 7, 9, 10, whatever the case is. Most of you seem to enjoy the first video and like the fact that we're doing a lecture. So just be aware of the fact that I want you to rank it. So that's what I'd like you to do when you're done with this. And I'm going to try to move along at a good pace. Some thought I went too fast. Some thought I went too slow. Remember, you can pause it as well as we're going. But we're going to get into it. So page 558 is where we're going to start. We're going to get into what's called the respiratory system. And you can see that on the very beginning of page 558, respiratory system. And in big red, it says functions of the respiratory system. So the main purpose of our respiratory system is to supply our oxygen with supply our body with oxygen and also get rid of carbon dioxide. We do that through a process called breathing. And you can see that here. Breathing is the movement of the chest that brings air into the lungs and removes waste gases like carbon dioxide. So we have this thing called cellular respiration, and what I'm going to have you do in just a few moments is pause the video, and I want you to write out the formula for cellular respiration. We've already gone over this, so you can start thinking about what that is, and I'll tell you when to pause and then write it out, and I'll give you the answer to see if you're in fact right. But cellular respiration in part involves oxygen, and how we get that oxygen into our body is through breathing, bringing oxygen from the atmosphere into our body. The waste product given off then is carbon dioxide. So for those of you that are getting ready here to do the cellular respiration, you might remember that there's an arrow, and then there's 2 things on the left and 3 things on the right. So I'm going to have you pause it, and you can try to think about what these what the equation is for cellular respiration. I'm going to keep going now. Pause it and see if you can come up with what these are. As I keep going, hopefully you pause and you came up with what the correct answer was for cellular respiration. You can see right here that we need oxygen for cellular respiration to take place, and we give off carbon dioxide. So in this part, we can put oxygen right here, and then we can put carbon dioxide given off. That's an important thing that the respiratory system does for our body. Now, in the previous chapters when we talked about cellular respiration, we of course said this was glucose, C6H12O6. You'll have to bear with my writing here. This isn't the best with what I'm doing. We give off carbon dioxide. We also give off water. Many of you commented that you found it interesting that the challenge I gave to you, especially if you're active, is to drink your body weight in ounces of water. That's your daily challenge, because you are constantly losing water. Even as you're sitting here exhaling, you're breathing out water. So again, if you weigh 105, 110 pounds, your goal should be to drink 105 or 110 ounces of water every day. That's a lot of water to be drinking. And then the big thing that we get from cellular respiration is energy. If you remember that, it's ATP. So that's one of the challenges, or excuse me, one of the big benefits that you have when doing cellular respiration. Now, the respiratory part of that, again, is us breathing to bring in oxygen right here and then give off that carbon dioxide right here. I put two challenges here. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but you can't breathe through your nose while smiling. Did you know that? Try that. Oh yeah, I guess you can. I just wanted to see you smile. That indicates that you're just loving this video. And then, did you know this one? You can't breathe through your nose while you stick your tongue out. You try that? I don't know if you can try that at home, but oh, you can. You just look like a dog when you do that. So just some fun science things for you to try out. Try that on your parents or a friend or something. But maybe corny. All right, we'll keep moving on. All right, so we get into the parts, the organs of the respiratory system. You can turn your book to page 560, and on 560 you can see a nice little diagram of all the parts of the respiratory system. I'm going to highlight them and go through them pretty fast. The pharynx here is a tube-like passageway used by food, liquid, and air. This is ultimately the tube that allows air to go through it, to start, you might say. Then your air passes over what's called a larynx. According to your book, it says that the larynx is kind of like your voice box. It is your voice box. It's your vocal cord. So your larynx is what allows you to talk. It's allowing me, as air passes out of my body, to vibrate over the voice box and create sound. The trachea, the next highlighted item in your book, is a tube that is held open with C-shaped rings. You can feel your trachea. If you feel in your throat right here, you can feel the cartilage rings of your trachea right in there. So that's your trachea. At the lower end of your trachea are these tubes called bronchi. You've maybe heard of someone who has bronchitis. That's an inflammation of those tubes. They're little. They split off from the trachea. We have bronchioles that split off of those bronchi, and then at the end of that we have these little sacs called alveoli, and it's actually at the alveoli where there's an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You can see a good picture of that on page 561. So I encourage you to look over those parts in your book. Here's a good picture of that as well for you to look through. Again, some things you should be aware of. The pharynx. It's kind of like your throat and the passageway that the air is going to go from your mouth down. The larynx, you can see, is this little voice box right there. The trachea, again, you can feel those in your throat. The bronchi are the two tubes that lead to each one of the lungs. Now, the lungs was not mentioned on the previous page. The lungs, there's a good picture of that on page 561 as well as 560. This is what holds these bronchioles, which would be right in here. They're not listed here. And then at the end of those, I'm going to get my pen here. These little guys are your alveoli, where the actual exchange happens between carbon dioxide and oxygen. So be aware of this picture. There's something similar to it on page 560, and then on 561 it breaks it down a little bit there as well. Continuing on with the respiratory system, we can see that there's another important part of your respiratory system, and I'm going to jump down, that's called the diaphragm. Now, the diaphragm is ultimately a muscle that allows us to inhale and exhale. It says signals from your brain tell your muscles in your chest and abdomen to contract and relax. If carbon dioxide levels in the blood increase, your breathing increases. If carbon dioxide levels decrease, then your breathing decreases. Ultimately, the more oxygen you need, or the more carbon dioxide you need to get rid of, your breathing increases. So what causes that? Your diaphragm is what's going to what fixes that problem. your diaphragm is going to contract and relax to help you to breathe. So know that word diaphragm. That's a muscle that helps all of this to take place, and it's located right in here. You can kind of see that diaphragm right there. Continuing along there's different diseases that can affect your respiratory system. You maybe have heard of some of these: emphysema, bronchitis. I'm going backwards. Emphysema, I don't know why I picked to go backwards. There's bronchitis. And then there's respiratory infections that can cause your upper respiratory tract or your lungs to be sort of in pain. They can be inflamed, and they can accrue different liquids and cause you to just not be comfortable. Things like colds, the flu, pneumonia, and then of course right now the big talk is COVID-19 and coronavirus that can infect your lungs and make it difficult to breathe, causing you to cough. And just overall, like I said, be uncomfortable. So there's different diseases and disorders that you guys are going to work through as well in an assignment that I gave you earlier. Lung cancer is another example of a disease, and asthma is another example. And I'm not going to give you a whole lot on this stuff right now because you guys are working on a project with that. I'm going to come back with some of those details a little bit later, but you're going to do some investigating on those diseases and how they affect the respiratory system. So just kind of be aware of that. Here's a couple pictures that I wanted to show you. Here is a very unhealthy lung. This is probably from someone who's been a regular smoker. There's a lot of tar built up on this person's lungs. This is a healthy lung. You can see a very big difference. Now, see just quickly if you can name this part here. And then there's a part here that you might be able to name. This is the same. This is letter B and this is letter A. You can pause it and tell me what those names are. If you did pause it, you're back at me. This would be the trachea right here coming down. You can see those little rings there, and B would be the bronchi. Now, again, I wanted to show you this more or less to see the difference in a healthy lung and an unhealthy lung. Now, smoking isn't as big of a problem nowadays as so much for you guys. Vaping is a big thing, and they're saying that vaping is very, very dangerous. It can cause lungs to really, really look terrible in a much shorter time than what smoking has done. So just be aware that someone who vapes, they're more likely to have lungs that look like this in a much shorter period of time than like this if you're a healthy individual getting lots of exercise and not putting anything harmful into your body like smoking or vaping. Here's again another good picture of this. Here's a healthy lung and here's a not healthy lung. So you kind of see the differences in those pictures. Now again, I told you guys at the end of the respiratory system section in your book, at the end of this section, there are some questions on page 564. I want you to answer 1, 2, and 6. So just make sure that you're doing that. I'm going to skip over here. I'm going to go back to this. This is going to wrap up now the respiratory system part of my talk. If you want to pause and take a break, you can pause and take a break, and I'm going to go into the circulatory system next. But this would ultimately be Chapter 16, Section 1, again in a nutshell. If you're with me, or you're back now, we're going to go on to the circulatory system, and I'm just going to do a brief run through on the circulatory system today, and then I'm going to later on post a second part of the circulatory system so my video doesn't get to be super long on you. But when we go to the circulatory system, this is a funny picture. This is actually my dad. When he was 45 years old, he had a really bad heart attack. So bad that you can see here. Here's a paddle, they call it, and here's a paddle that they use to try and shock his heart out of what's called fibrillation. They try to defib it, and they had to do that up to 15 times on my dad. I'm going to tell you that story in my second video, but I thought this was a funny picture. Funny now, of course, that my dad is alive and doing well, that I'd introduce this to you on. Your heart is a part of your circulatory system and is obviously an incredibly important organ. If that doesn't work the way it's supposed to, we have problems. we don't live. So that's a little note on the circulatory system there. So what is your circulatory system? Well, I put your cardiovascular system or your circulatory system is made up of three things: the blood, the heart, and the blood vessels. Now we're going to break down each of these in part today and in part in your next video. But the main thing that your heart does, or excuse me, your circulatory system does, is move stuff to every area of your body. I like what they put on page 566. They have a picture of a road system because they're comparing your circulatory system to transportation. We are trying to deliver things throughout the United States. And how we do that, we load it up into different vehicles and we transport it from one place to another. That's what your circulatory system is doing. It's taking the nutrients from your digestive system and delivering it to the right spots. It's taking that oxygen from your lungs and delivering it to the right spots. It's taking waste products and bringing it to the kidney so your kidney can clean those out. It's taking carbon dioxide, bringing it back to your lungs so you can exhale that stuff out. So that's what your circulatory system is all about. Here's a great picture of your heart. Our heart is about the size of our fist, and it has several important parts to it that we're going to learn. The right atrium, the right ventricle. So this here is the right atrium. And the right ventricle you can't see really good, but I'd call this our right ventricle. You can see your left ventricle here and your left atrium here. Those are parts you need to know. We've got the aorta, which is a giant blood vessel, the biggest of our blood vessels that brings blood away from the left ventricle. And we'll learn more about this stuff later. We've got our pulmonary arteries, which I want you to know, and our pulmonary veins, which I want you to know. We also have these things called vena cavas. The inferior vena cava is located right here, and that brings all the blood from the lower half of our body, inferior, meaning below, to the heart, and the superior vena cava brings all the blood from the top of our body down to our heart, superior meaning above. So these are the parts that I want you to know, and there's good pictures in your book, again, of the heart. You can look on page 568 and 569 to see those pictures of the heart. A lot of this I already mentioned. Your heart has four chambers. It has two atria, the right and the left, and it has two ventricles, the right and the left. Note that each of these in this picture is opposite the way that you look at it, because this heart is like it was in my body. Just to show you a little bit on that. Right now, I don't know how this is mirroring. I hope it's mirroring the way it should. It might look like I'm raising my left hand, but this is actually my right hand, and this is my left hand. Even though it looks different on your screen, depending on how this mirrored, that's how you'd look at your heart. So this is the right side of my heart, and this is the left side of my heart. So when you look at it, that's why we've got opposite sides here. Hopefully that makes sense. There's a valve, a one-way valve, meaning blood only is meant to go one way through the heart. There's a valve that separates each of the atria from the ventricle. So on the right side of our heart, we have a tricuspid valve, and on the left side, we have a bicuspid valve. I always remember that as when we track blood, we're going to go from the right side and then eventually go to the left side. So I think it goes through the tricuspid valve before it goes through the bicuspid valve. And I don't have a good picture of that on here, but on page 569 of your book, you can get an idea of where those valves are located. So we've got these valves. There's also, it's worth noting, a thick wall between the two atria and the two ventricles. We never want blood to mix from the right side to the left side. So there's a thick wall. If we were to cut this heart open, there's a thick wall here. It's called the septum, and that makes sure that no blood transfers from one side to the other. It can go from the right atrium to the right ventricle, but never to the left side. Reason for that is we need to keep our oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separate. So here we can see good pictures of our valves. We can see here that we've got the tricuspid valve and we've got the bicuspid valve. And we can see right in here, not real great, but there's a big septum that keeps those two sides of the hearts separate. All right, so here is a real good challenge for you now. The challenge is to learn the pathway of blood. Where does blood go? I'm going to ask you to pause this in just a second and see if you can fill in these blanks, and then I'm going to take you through this. It's going to be tough, but if you look through section 2, you might be able to answer all these blanks. But I want you to know the pathway of blood. So pause it and see if you can answer. Coming out of the pause now, I'm hoping that you have answers written down. Here's what the pathway of blood is. So we will start, when we study the pathway of blood, we'll start with the right atrium. Blood leaves the right atrium, so we're going to start with blood right in here. We've got blood in here. It's the right atrium. Where does it go? Well, if you look at this picture, you can see there's a tricuspid valve here, so blood goes through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle. So that's what we should put here. So through the, and I'm going to abbreviate, tricuspid valve, that's TV, not what you're watching later on tonight, but tricuspid valve, so just tricuspid because I have valve there, into the RV, not the recreational vehicle, but the right ventricle. Blood then will leave the heart through the pulmonary artery and go where? Well, here we've got this is the pulmonary artery. It's leaving the pulmonary artery and going this way and that way to, where do you think? Hopefully you put down it's going to the lungs. And then it says here, and I kind of gave that away in this next part, it leaves the lungs, so blood's going to leave the lungs and go through, going back here. The lungs are not a part of this picture, but the blood is going to come back through this thing right here, and this would be the pulmonary, bringing it to the heart. It leaves the lungs through the pulmonary vein and goes into the left atrium. LA is what I'm going to put here. Once it's gotten into this left atrium, so the blood has come into this left atrium, it's going to go down through the bicuspid valve, which we see here. It's these little white fibers, and into the left ventricle. So going into here, it's going to go through the bicuspid, and I'll put BIC because I've already got valve there, into the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle is going to be the main source of what's pumping our blood to the rest of our body, and it needs to have a really big blood vessel for that to go through. So the biggest blood vessel in our entire body is this guy right here. This is the aorta. And you can see that on top there's big branches. That's going to bring the blood up to our head region. The aorta is going to continue all the way down and have all these blood vessels that leak off of it, or branch off of it, I should say, so that blood can get to every part of our body. So this is the aorta. You maybe remember when we dissected the worms, there was something called an aortic arch. It's kind of like its hearts, but they don't really have hearts. They have these little blood vessels, or these big blood vessels that help to bring that blood. Aorta is what we're talking about in humans, aortic arches in worms. Then we have arteries that carry blood away from the heart. I'm going to put ART for arteries. They're going to carry blood away from the heart. Eventually, they're going to lead to these little tiny vessels called capillaries. And this is all a part of your text. If you're following along with me in your book, this would be on page 570. After we've dropped off that oxygenated blood, we're going to pick up carbon dioxide, and those veins are going to bring that carbon dioxide and the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. It's going to eventually lead to the two big vena cavas, which I showed you in this picture here, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So that's what we should have for this, is superior and inferior vena cava, S and I. So I want you to know this information and be able to go through that pathway of blood. So again, you can go back, pause, practice this, do this however you'd like, but know this. My last question is on this slide is, why do you think the heart is so strong? It's because it's always pumping iron. I had to pause there so you could laugh at that joke. But really, when we talked about digestion and nutrition, we're putting things like iron, which is a mineral, into our body when we eat, and the blood is pumping that as well as every other mineral, vitamin, carbohydrates, proteins, everywhere throughout the body. It's including things like when we breathe, when we're talking respiration, oxygen is being pumped throughout the body. So your heart is a very, very strong organ. There's 3 types of circulation that you need to be aware of. What I'm going to do is just highlight these and talk very briefly about each. Coronary is when we're pumping blood from the heart to the heart. I want to show you this picture here. You can see that there are blood vessels on the heart. Our heart needs to have nutrition, the nutrients that we put into our body. Our heart needs to have oxygen, so we actually will pump blood to our heart to make sure that that's healthy. That's called coronary circulation, when we're pumping blood from the heart to the heart. You maybe have heard of that word pulmonary before. Pulmonary circulation is when the blood is being pumped from the heart to the lungs. The word pulmonary is associated with the lungs. And systemic circulation is everything else. So not to the heart, not to the lungs, but everywhere else in the body. That's called systemic circulation. So be aware of these 3 types of circulation. Very quickly, I mentioned this already, arteries are blood vessels that carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart. And veins are going to be blood vessels that carry oxygen-poor blood back to the heart. Capillaries are microscopic blood vessels that connect arteries to veins, and this is where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place. I'm going to wrap up here. I probably went a little longer than some of you would have liked. Here again is your assignment, and I want to make sure that you're aware of it. I'm not going to explain it again, but here's your assignment that I'd like you to do either on Schoology or you can email that. That's a quick crash course on 16.1 and 16.2, respiration and circulation. I look forward to hearing your guys' comments and getting your assignments back. Again, I hope you're all doing good, and we'll talk to you later.